February 12, 1946. The air inside room 14 of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice carried the scent of stale tobacco and worn leather. Morning light filtered through barred windows, casting iron shadows across a metal table where an aging man sat with his hands folded, his field-gray uniform stripped of its insignia. Former General Oberst Franz Halder, once chief of the German Army General Staff, stared at the American intelligence officers across from him with eyes that had witnessed the machinery of total war. Outside, the rubble of a shattered Reich still smoldered. Inside, history itself was being reconstructed, one testimony at a time. The stenographer's typewriter clicked in rhythmic patterns, transcribing words that would unravel the hidden architecture of Hitler's command structure, secrets that had been sealed behind oak doors and encrypted radio transmissions for 6 years of unprecedented carnage. Franz Halder was not like the theatrical personalities who dominated the main Nuremberg trials. He possessed no Göring's bombast, no Ribbentrop's aristocratic pretense. He was a professional soldier from Bavaria, a meticulous staff officer whose handwritten war diaries would eventually fill 6 volumes and become one of the most comprehensive records of Hitler's military decision-making process ever compiled. Between 1938 and 1942, Halder had stood at the nerve center of German military operations, translating Hitler's strategic visions into operational orders that sent millions of men across the frontiers of Europe. Now, in the aftermath of Germany's unconditional surrender, American interrogators had discovered something remarkable. This former general was willing to talk, to document, to reveal the internal contradictions and fatal flaws that had existed at the very heart of the Nazi war machine from its inception. The German army that marched into Poland in September 1939 represented what many observers considered the most professionally competent military force in the world. Its officer corps had inherited the tactical brilliance of the Prussian military tradition, refined through generations of staff college training and doctrinal innovation. These men expected to serve a rational strategic framework, to apply their professional expertise within a command structure that respected military logic and operational realities. They had been raised on Clausewitz and Moltke, on the principle that war was politics by other means, conducted through careful calculation of means and ends. What they discovered instead was something that defied their entire professional education: a supreme commander who operated on intuition, racial ideology, and an apocalyptic vision of struggle that recognized no limits, no compromise, no rational boundaries between possible and impossible objectives. Halder's testimony, corroborated by thousands of pages of captured documents and cross-referenced with accounts from other Wehrmacht officers, painted a portrait of a command structure fundamentally broken from the beginning. Hitler had assumed direct operational control over military planning in a manner unprecedented in modern warfare. He involved himself in tactical details, down to battalion-level deployments, while simultaneously ignoring basic strategic realities like logistics, industrial capacity, and geographic constraints. The Führer would spend hours positioning divisions on maps with a ruler, calculating distances as if willpower alone could overcome fuel shortages and supply line vulnerabilities. He viewed military science through the lens of social Darwinism and racial mythology, believing that ideological purity and fighting spirit could substitute for material preparation and sound operational planning. The interrogators learned of directive after directive that had made professional officers recoil in disbelief. In the summer of 1940, with Britain undefeated and invasion preparations incomplete, Hitler had ordered preliminary planning for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Halder described how senior commanders had attempted to present the logistical impossibilities. Germany lacked the fuel reserves, the transportation capacity, the winter equipment for a campaign across the Russian interior. The Soviet Union possessed virtually unlimited space for strategic depth, industrial facilities beyond the Urals that German bombers could never reach, and a population that dwarfed Germany's mobilization capacity. The professional assessment was clear: a two-front war against both the British Empire and the Soviet Union represented strategic suicide. Hitler dismissed these concerns as defeatist thinking, insisting that the Soviet state would collapse within weeks, once struck with sufficient force. He believed his own propaganda about Slavic inferiority and communist political fragility. The greatest military gamble in modern history was predicated not on strategic calculation but on ideological fantasy. Halder revealed the exact moment when he had begun maintaining his secret war diary in its most detailed form, not as an official record but as a personal documentation of decisions he believed were leading Germany toward catastrophe. On July 31, 1940, during a conference at the Berghof, Hitler had announced his determination to attack the Soviet Union in May 1941. The reasoning he provided defied military logic. He claimed that Britain remained in the war only because it hoped for eventual Soviet intervention. Therefore, eliminating the Soviet Union would force British capitulation. This inverted causality, attacking one potential enemy to somehow defeat a current enemy, represented the kind of strategic reasoning that would have earned a failing grade at any staff college. Yet it became the foundation for the largest military operation in human history. Halder documented the exchange in careful script, recording not just the orders but the expressions of disbelief among professional officers who found themselves powerless to inject rational analysis into a process driven by ideological conviction and personal will. The invasion of the Soviet Union began on June 28, 1941, involving over 3 million German soldiers advancing across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The initial weeks seemed to confirm Hitler's predictions as German armored spearheads encircled massive Soviet formations, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Hitler became increasingly convinced of his own military genius, dismissing the professional advice of his general staff with growing contempt. But then came the rains of autumn and the frozen ground of winter. The Wehrmacht discovered that it had prepared for a short war of annihilation, but instead faced an endless campaign of attrition against an enemy with inexhaustible reserves. Halder's diary entries from late 1941 documented the growing desperation in operational planning meetings. Units were running out of ammunition, vehicles were breaking down without replacement parts, and soldiers were collapsing from exhaustion and exposure. The professional officers requested permission for tactical withdrawals to consolidate defensive positions for winter. Hitler refused, demanding that every meter of ground be held regardless of casualties or tactical sense. December 1941 marked a turning point that Halder described with particular precision during his interrogations. Soviet counteroffensives pushed German forces back from Moscow's outskirts. Just as winter descended with full Siberian fury, temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms because Hitler had forbidden winter supply preparations as defeatist, began dying of exposure in greater numbers than from enemy fire. Field commanders requested permission for strategic withdrawals to defensible lines. Hitler issued his stand fast order instead. No retreat, no surrender, every position to be held to the last man. Some military historians would later argue this prevented total collapse. Halder's assessment was more nuanced. The order might have prevented immediate disaster, but it established a precedent that would prove catastrophic. Hitler now believed that his willpower could override material reality, that fanaticism was a substitute for strategy. The interrogators pressed for details about specific commands that revealed Hitler's operational methods. Halder provided examples that illustrated the fundamental disconnect between military professionalism and ideological warfare. In September 1941, as Army Group North approached Leningrad, Hitler had ordered the city not captured but besieged and starved into extinction. The military objective was not to defeat enemy forces, but to eliminate an entire urban population as a demonstration of racial war. Similarly, Hitler had forbidden tactical flexibility on the Eastern Front, insisting that every counterattack be met with immediate counterattack, regardless of local force ratios. He viewed defensive operations as symptoms of weak leadership rather than sound tactical practice. Officers who requested permission for withdrawals were often relieved of command and sometimes arrested. The professional military virtue of adapting tactics to circumstances was redefined as cowardice and betrayal. Halder's own dismissal in September 1942 came after months of escalating conflict with Hitler over operational planning for the southern offensive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The campaign plan violated basic principles of concentration of force, attempting simultaneous drives toward objectives hundreds of kilometers apart with insufficient reserves to support either thrust. Halder had advocated for focusing resources on a single, decisive objective. Hitler insisted that his forces could achieve both goals through aggressive action and superior will. When Halder persisted in his professional objections, citing logistics and force calculations, Hitler dismissed him from command and replaced him with more compliant officers. Within months, the Sixth Army was encircled in Stalingrad's ruins, and the entire southern front faced collapse. The dismissal of professional military judgment in favor of ideological certainty had produced exactly the disaster that staff calculations had predicted. The American interrogators began to understand something that would reshape historical understanding of the Nazi war effort. Germany had not lost the war simply because it was outproduced or outnumbered by Allied coalitions. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with a fundamental strategic handicap. Its supreme commander operated according to principles that guaranteed self-destruction regardless of tactical brilliance or soldier courage. Hitler's command method was not merely flawed. It was systemically irrational, rooted in assumptions about race, will, and historical destiny that bore no relationship to actual military realities. Every major strategic decision, the two-front war, the invasion timetable for Russia, the refusal to allow tactical retreats, the diversion of resources to extermination operations, reflected this disconnect between ideological conviction and strategic rationality. Halder revealed that resistance among the professional officer corps had existed from the earliest stages but had been fractured and ultimately ineffective. Some officers had considered a coup in 1938 during the Czech crisis, believing Hitler's recklessness would lead Germany to premature war. The Munich Agreement had undermined their position by apparently validating Hitler's aggressive diplomacy. After the stunning victories in Poland and France, opposition became almost impossible to organize. Hitler's prestige reached untouchable heights, and any officer who questioned his methods could be dismissed as incompetent or jealous. The oath of loyalty, that officers had sworn directly to the Führer, created a psychological barrier that most professional soldiers found impossible to cross. The military tradition they had inherited emphasized obedience, duty, and political neutrality. These very virtues became mechanisms of complicity, binding professional competence to ideological madness. The documents that emerged from Halder's interrogations and from the broader captured archives revealed the hidden war commands in granular detail. The Commissar Order of June 1941 had instructed Wehrmacht units to immediately execute Soviet political officers upon capture, violating every convention of warfare and implicating the regular army in war crimes from the campaign's first day. The severity order had authorized collective reprisals against civilian populations for partisan activities, making no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The systematic starvation policy for Soviet prisoners of war, which killed over 3 million men by war's end, had been implemented with Wehrmacht logistical support and command authorization. These were not the actions of rogue SS units operating beyond military control. They were deliberate policies integrated into operational planning at the highest levels of command. Halder himself occupied an ambiguous position in this landscape of complicity. He had objected to strategic decisions on professional grounds, but had implemented orders he found operationally unsound. He had documented his disagreements in private diaries, but had not refused orders or resigned in protest when resignation might have mattered. His testimony at Nuremberg and in subsequent interrogations served multiple purposes. It provided invaluable historical documentation. It helped establish the record of Nazi criminality, and it also allowed him to construct a narrative of professional resistance that somewhat obscured his own role in executing criminal policies. The interrogators recognized this complexity, valuing his information while understanding that his account was shaped by self-justification as much as by historical accuracy. The symbolic object that haunted the interrogation transcripts was not a weapon or a strategic map, but something simpler: the leather-bound diary itself, pages filled with meticulous handwriting documenting decisions in real time. That diary represented the last refuge of professional military culture, the careful recording of facts, dates, force dispositions, and command decisions. In a regime where reality was subordinated to ideology, where facts became optional and statistics were manufactured to support predetermined conclusions, the diary was an act of resistance through documentation. It preserved a record that contradicted official propaganda and command mythology. When American intelligence officers first examined Halder's diaries in 1945, they recognized something extraordinary: an insider's chronicle of how strategic irrationality had been systematized into operational doctrine. The revelations continued through months of interrogations and document reviews. Other captured generals corroborated and expanded Halder's accounts. Field Marshal von Manstein described Hitler's interference in operational details on the Eastern Front. General Warlimont detailed the chaos of the OKW command structure, where Hitler's personal military staff bypassed the professional general staff entirely. Colonel Adolf Heusinger explained how strategic planning had become exercises in confirming Hitler's predetermined decisions rather than objective analysis of options. The cumulative portrait was devastating. The German military machine had been directed by a command system that actively suppressed professional expertise, punished honest assessment, and rewarded ideological conformity over operational competence. By 1943, even the most optimistic German strategic assessments recognized that victory was impossible. The industrial capacity of the United States, the manpower reserves of the Soviet Union, and the technological advantages of Allied air power had created an imbalance that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. Professional military analysis indicated that the only rational course was negotiated settlement while Germany still held defensive positions. Hitler rejected any consideration of negotiation, insisting that the war would continue until either total victory or total destruction. This was not a military strategy, but an apocalyptic vision in which the German people would be tested through annihilation. When Allied forces crossed Germany's borders in 1945, Hitler issued orders for the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure, bridges, factories, power stations, to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The man who had claimed to be Germany's savior was now orchestrating its suicide. The epilogue of Halder's revelations extended far beyond the interrogation rooms of Nuremberg. His diaries would be translated, published, and become foundational sources for understanding Hitler's war. The hidden commands he revealed, the strategic fantasies, the criminal orders, the systematic suppression of professional military judgment, demonstrated how totalitarian ideology corrupts every institution it touches, including those built on centuries of professional tradition. The German General Staff had imagined itself as a politically neutral instrument of state policy, a professional body dedicated to military excellence. What Halder's testimony revealed was the impossibility of that neutrality once democratic institutions had been dismantled. Without legal constraints, without civilian oversight responsible to the governed, without freedom of information and dissent, professional competence became merely a more efficient instrument of tyranny. The larger truth that emerged from those interrogation transcripts spoke to the fundamental incompatibility between totalitarian systems and rational decision-making. Hitler's command structure failed not because it lacked intelligent officers or capable soldiers, but because it systematically excluded reality from planning processes. In a democracy, even a flawed one, competing interests and institutional checks create friction that prevents any single vision from dominating absolutely. Information flows from multiple sources. Failures trigger investigations. Disasters prompt leadership changes. In Hitler's Germany, all channels of information had been subordinated to a single personality, whose judgments could not be questioned, whose errors could not be corrected, whose fantasies became operational requirements. The hidden war commands revealed in 1946 demonstrated that Nazi Germany had not been defeated by superior Allied virtue, but had destroyed itself through structural irrationality, a system that made catastrophic failure inevitable, regardless of individual courage or tactical brilliance. In that cold interrogation room in Nuremberg, as Franz Halder methodically reconstructed the decision-making processes that had led to 50 million deaths, the stenographer's typewriter continued its rhythmic clicking, preserving testimony that would echo through decades of historical scholarship. The former general spoke in calm, professional tones about commands that had violated every principle of military science, about orders that had transformed soldiers into executioners, about strategic decisions rooted in racial mythology rather than operational reality. His revelations carried a warning that extended far beyond the specific crimes of the Nazi regime, that professional competence without moral constraint, that technical expertise without democratic accountability, that institutional loyalty without legal limitation can serve not as barriers against tyranny, but as mechanisms of its implementation. The hidden war commands of Adolf Hitler, meticulously documented in those February interrogations, revealed not just the history of one regime's collapse, but a timeless lesson about the fragility of reason when confronted by absolute power, unrestrained by law, unchallenged by dissent, and unmoored from the fundamental recognition that human beings possess dignity beyond ideology and rights beyond the state's convenience.